do it.
All right. Well, yeah, decision making and exercise process and programming is something clearly we spend a lot of time talking about in the muscle system specialist course, to be sure. And, here's an attempt in section 19 to talk about, causal factors. Well, why does someone, a new client, show up and display themselves, express themselves with all their limits and potentials the way they do? And these are some of the, I guess, categories that I'm thinking about in decision making when we're looking at, again, fundamentally trying to improve their voluntary motor control, framed within whatever their stated fundamental objectives are. So relating those two concepts, what they want from their system in the future, and where is it now? Why is it the way it is now? And is how it got to the way it is now going to influence where we want to go and how we get there? So that's really kind of how I'm thinking about it, kind of from a means ends analytical model. And on the far left, right, we talk about client injury and disease history. And in looking at the chronology of that, I think the chronological sequence can be important. The earliest injuries and the most recent traumas.
Agreed.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. And we're looking for any kind of trauma, any athletic, recreational injury, anything that could have left its mark on their system in some way. And spinal injuries clearly have, and head injuries, we should probably add to that.
Right. Concussions
are really key in helping us, figure out why they might be presenting the way they are and what we might do. And then, of course, extremity injuries. So, generally we got to look at those things. And I've been, putting those up there in terms of hierarchy and priority, right? About how I'm thinking about why they're doing what they're doing and what I might do with that history and that part of the body when I'm making decisions about exercise. So really big deal.
Right on. Agreed.
And sometimes those little injuries, they don't really leave a big mark and they don't leave a big problem, but many times they do.
Do you think that sometimes it depends on what was done with the joint or the tissue post injury? Like if they didn't give it an opportunity to recover, like if they're playing a sport and they had an injury and then, instead of letting it recover fully, they go and they start using the section of the system again right away. I feel like that would probably make a major difference to the.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whether they had, a physical therapy or rehabilitation therapy of any kind following an injury or not. And with the whole concept of the incomplete rehab syndrome, where even if they had rehabilitation, it probably wasn't, fully restorative,
right.
In a sense, to the system. So yeah. And those matter. I find that more and more, and it definitely gives me leads to, in terms of, what I'm going to measure, what I'm going to observe, how I'm going to interpret quality, why there could be sensory reports that don't make any sense, and then give me leads to sample, quality of motor output and the other stuff that we do. So yeah, big deal. And many people have had injuries with no rehabilitation, even surgeries. When I had my gallbladder removed and they, poked 4 holes in my, stomach, took out an organ, they didn't order rehabilitation. They didn't order anything to help me kind of restore my, musculoskeletal system after poking 4 holes in it.
You're freezing up a little bit. You've frozen up a little bit a couple times on my end. I don't know if it's the Zoom.
Hmm. Let me turn off my Wi-Fi for my phone and my computer. All right, yeah, I'm not getting any glitches or any signals. So
Okay. I just wanted to give you a heads up because
yeah,
on
sometimes it'll flash a little screen that says, connection unstable,
right.
but I haven't been getting that. So yeah, then the occupational stressors, clearly occupational, daily or at least high frequency postures and, external stressors and internal stressors, and patterns of stress, and what they've been doing with exercise and what their work environment is like is another one that's a big deal. I mean, what is the system conditions that it finds itself under most of the time?
Right. What's exposed to every single day.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a hanging board, every day, you're a painter, commercial painter, holding a sprayer and taping and doing all this stuff over your head and holding stuff over your head and walking around on stilts and screwing, board up into ceilings, and and the person's got neck and back and shoulder and elbow problems. Well, okay, no wonder.
Right. Cutting hair. I mean, anything that just, repetitive use of the fingers,
Musicians,
shoulders. Yeah. Musicians.
that are practicing a lot for sure. So yeah, these things feed into some of that. Some of the decisions there could just be as simple as, we're not even going to put any additional stress on that area, versus trying to come up with exercises that might counteract those mechanical stressors. And then obviously the emotional psychological stuff, which we try to get a sense of in the consultation process. We've got a good system there to start to figure out what's going on. Are we dealing with depression, anxieties, and any relationship stressors? And we've got questions on our questionnaire to address some of these things, because when someone is depressed, they experience the world in a different way than when not depressed, right? Symptoms tend to get elevated, and they don't react the same way to different stressors. So yeah, those are really important things. And then of course, any diagnoses they have with neurological, metabolic, orthopedic, those things that are going to impinge on, their motor control and motor outputs, have to be considered. And there's quite a diverse amount of problems that could exist there, that affect tolerance to exercise stress,
Right.
and response and recovery, for sure. And then, nutrition, what have they been eating? What's their body mass, insulin sensitivities, carbohydrate addictions? What are they doing for supplementation, and the chemistry of that? And then undiagnosed pathologies. What do they physically complain about? A lot of people self-diagnose. I'm always curious about what they think's going on. I think I have plantar fasciitis. I think I've got tennis elbow. I think I've got, right. And they give
whatever I read about on the internet.
That's so I'm like, okay, well, what have you been doing? What do you think's going on? And then again, they're acute and chronic and past injuries that created diseases that they never got diagnosed medically properly. So yeah, that's the big picture of kind of the rough sketch of the causal factors that could be feeding into why they present the way they do. And we could probably add genetics to this somewhere, and medications we could probably add to this list. So I'll look at updating that.
What about, I don't know if this is the right place for it, but what about, in regards to some of the decision-making factors, what about, the range of motion limits, 1s, 2s, 3s, how we, kind of link that into some of this stuff.
Yeah. Again, that's the interesting thing, is when we take our samples and we look at the profile, what could explain why, one shoulder system is so asymmetrical in multiple degrees of freedom as another. And then we look at injury histories, right? Chronic patterns, orthopedic diseases, and we start to go, okay, this could be why potentially you have this issue over here. And we have to be, sensitive to that because of the material control sensation paradigm that, these materials that we're affecting through exercise, even though, we're trying to affect skeletal muscle, and how in this quote underneath here, skeletal muscle is an amazing material. If you want to look at it as a material, a living dynamic material that can change itself or is highly malleable and changeable, that, Dr. Toigo wrote an interesting article here, and I found this quote in it, and that, fundamental mechanical stimuli is decoded by skeletal muscle, and really muscles have three strategies of quantitative or qualitative effects on muscular phenotype, which just means how they express themselves from their genotype, and how do they adjust against altered functional demands. And they can either improve or degrade longitudinally, positively or negatively radially, so they, this way and this way, and then contractily, and the metabolic tuning of that. And so adaptational strategies can happen concurrently or separately, depending on the specificity of the physiological or pathophysiologic conditions. So this is where any of those, general causal factors we just talked about could be influencing the skeletal muscle system, let alone bones and tendons and ligaments and blood vessels and all that other stuff, and the energetic aspects, in negative ways and in positive ways. And exercise-induced physiologic conditions can be viewed as the perturbation of the muscle cell's tensional integrity. And perturbation of tensional integrity occurs by increasing or decreasing myocellular active or passive tension and energy production or absorption. And so all these alterations, sustained for different durations, code how the muscle's gonna change itself. It's wild.
Amazing.
And temporal changes in active and passive tension, together with inferred structural insults, are decoded at the molecular level, and then a response is initiated. Whether response is good or bad, right? The tissue is going to respond. So this is why it's such an important thing to look at these stressors, these causal factors, and start to realize how might they have affected, the way the muscle tissue, the muscle system operates. How has it coded itself now, based on all these potential influencers. Unbelievable. So, and then fundamentally looking at muscle as this rate of force creation and development of some peak force, depending on what's going on in the torque values and all the things it's got to do, and how long it can sustain that peak force, and then how quickly it can relax and get back to a pre-contracted state, and then recovery, and then all five of these, phases of the basic idea of muscle developing no tension to some tension to no tension and getting ready to do that again, is what we're dealing with exercise.
Right.
All the time, and how quickly force can be created, how steep that slope is, whatever peak force is possible for the joint angle and the link tension, and all the different cross-sectional areas and all the things that contribute to peak force from our observational level, which is gross aggregate output, how long someone can sustain a peak force once it's attained, and then how quickly can the rate of force be abated or controlled, which we rarely check. And it's important that muscle be able to relax again. And
Right.
That's where that passive voluntary isometric can be helpful, where you actually, as a practitioner, after a set or a couple reps, take away the stress and see if the system has relaxed. And you can do that simply by having them relax in your hands, if you will, and then when they say they're relaxed, let go and see if the limb drops or not. And of course, you got to coach them, not to be reflexively holding their arm up, but
right.
There should be some relaxation. I'm sure there's palpation techniques that you could kind of get a sense of whether the muscle contraction and the firmness or tone of the tissue is changing or not. But there's a variety of muscle diseases that affect rate of force abatement. Hypotonic diseases, and that exercise actually exacerbates that. So
right.
It's another important aspect of what we should be trying to observe, let alone trying to understand how quickly something recovers, because my goodness, tissues that have been injured and underused and understimulated for a long time, they got problems at probably all of these particular key points. They can't create force rapidly. They can't develop much force. They can't sustain it for very long. Doesn't relax well, and its recovery is terrible. It takes forever,
So your operating window for perturbation is going to be really small.
Really small. Really small. And you're going to see, even with what might appear to be very low level intensity or volume exercise or stimulation, they do not recover well. And that will be shown up as, again, rate of force creation, loss of peak force, unable to sustain, right? And so, this is critical for exercise prescription. Setting up how many reps, rests, how frequently. Wow.
What modes to use first? Probably
isometric, plyometric. So it's a complicated situation. It's going to take a little, some real specific observations and sampling to help figure some of this out. And what conditions do we set up with exercise that potentiate, so that subsequent contractions you see increases in rate of force creation and increases in peak force and increases in sustainability, right? Versus fatigue, where you see this whole thing collapse. And what do myometric reps look like and plyometric reps look like, and how do we conclude quality? And that's really some of our key things. And so much of what we do is, when we choose exercise loads, if you will, they tend to be myometrically referenced, where we have to contract shorten first before anything else happens, like an isometric or switching directions and going plyometrically. Some exercises do start plyometrically, like a flat bench press. You take the weight off and you
lower it.
Yep, you get into an iso for a second, and then you lower it, and you hit an iso, and then you myo that thing, right? But many exercises do not start that way. Can you think of any more? What are some of the normal name traditional exercises that?
Well, a barbell squat, you would lower first and then
right. So that's
come down.
It's a plyometric first, right? Deadlifting is myo.
Myo
right?
first. Yep.
Yeah, and then and then what's interesting about that to me is how that's affected. Leveraging what we know about the force velocity curve and what it tells us from skin to muscle and detached from the system and the experiments that you can read about, how they determine this graph, and that how quickly muscle contracts affects how much force it produces. And generally speaking, we generate more force isometrically or plyometrically, even with increasing velocity, which is interesting. You know, real fast muscle shortening, not very much force is produced, but you know, rapid muscle lengthening produces more force until you tear something, which is why
Right.
that drops off, you know, almost like a stress strain curve. And I turned the typical force velocity curve I rotated it on its axis. So normally you'll see the velocity side, which is now shown on the Y axis, on the X axis. I like looking at it this way better because I'm tracking force.
Right. We're seeing if we can lift the curve, right?
Yeah. So isometrics might lift the curve and lift everything up, relatively speaking. So even though you don't develop as much force when you move fast, you're still developing more force than you were before, even at the same velocities, as you get stronger. And so, you know, leveraging this idea, if we're beginning an exercise with the plyometric, where we generally again can produce more force output, what would the myometric be like? Like, how are we going to choose the workload if the first thing we feel is the plyometric versus the first thing we feel or experience effort-wise comes from the myometric, which doesn't produce as much force necessarily as the plyometric. And so, you know, this is often, I think, why we don't get as strong as we're capable of, because we're choosing loads myometrically all the time.
Right. Well, because a lot of equipment is set up that way. Like we were saying a second ago, it's sometimes hard to get it set up so that you can start with the plyo. You almost have to have a trainer there with you to help you do that.
Yeah.
Under a lot of conditions.
Yeah. And if you're by yourself, you can't do it. So you don't know what you can handle plyometrically.
Probably a lot more than you think.
Yeah,
my
right.
guess.
Yeah, let alone isometrically. So at different points. So yeah, so this is all really important stuff. Again, especially against the backdrop of, you know, what's the rate of force creation for a myometric versus the rate of force creation for a plyometric, right? And what's the peak force capability from myo to peak force versus plyo to peak force? Are those the same?
Probably not. I mean, it could be. I mean, that's the whole thing. You know, you were saying the other day about, you know, using this example of having clients, you know, sometimes start on the plyo end with equipment, you know, just seeing how many they can do that way, then seeing how many they can myo, because it may not be the same. They may be great on the myo end, but they may be crap on the plyo.
Which is, yeah, always interests me to no end. And sometimes I'll sit people in, you know, for instance, a overhead shoulder press, and I'll have them do bilateral. And it's one of the benefits of selectorized machines is, you know, they can myometric up and then they can drop an arm off.
Right.
Now they can plyo down, and I can have them repeat that back and forth until I can see if there's a big difference between the left and right side plyometrically, let alone myometrically. Or, you know, they can go up with both, drop one arm off, plyo down, and then I ask them if they myo back up from the plyo. And you'll see sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, right? You know, it's kind of a bizarre thing to watch, asymmetries in plyo-myo and isometric sequencing. So we have to look at the control of the system, you know, under these three basic ideas, myos, plyos, and isos, to really get a better look at what's going on with the control system for a scenario, for a configuration and set of conditions.
So after you would do that, if you would see, you know, a deficit in either the myo end or the iso end or the plyo end of this given exercise setup, then are you then or then checking quality and various configurations that are, associated with the exercise challenge,
Yeah.
seeing what part of the system's breaking down.
Yep.
Because I mean, with what you're talking about with the overhead press, I mean, we're dealing with a lot of tissue there. Basically, the
right?
entire upward rotation system. It could be potentially be the stabilizing
The
effect of
elbow,
the cervical spine, the elbow.
could be the elbow. Yep.
Depends
on whether their back is supported or not supported. So, yep, all of that needs to be considered. And so, it might give you a lead for sampling more, and kind of biasing your samples to more specific single synovial joint actions versus multiple joint actions. Right? And I don't always see that. Sometimes I'll see, I can make an individual joint action better, but then when I put it in with a group of other joints, it still doesn't work quite, well. So it needs that integration training. This idea that if you build the pieces, automatically the whole gets better. I don't always see that.
Not sure that's the case, huh?
I don't always see that. Yeah. Again, maybe it's a learning thing, because now the brain's doing something different. When it's using my elbow extensor, independent of anything else, and it's using my shoulder flexor independent of anything else, and, my clavicle and scapula is upwardly rotating independent, and then I improve those things sort of individually and put them together. The brain still has to what? Put it together.
Get it all the pieces. Make
still
a
has to learn
stew of muscle contraction.
Yeah, it still has to learn how to do that. So I don't know if it did or not just by doing the pieces, right? So we got to check. And so our basic objective of, let's find some lower quality motor outputs, VR perturbations, initiate potentiation if we can, so that we can, help the system along for some selected configuration, try to improve the movement quality as perceived by both the practitioner and the client, and then, start a progression of, force creation, peak force creation, maintenance per unit time, how quickly they can relax, and how quickly can they recover. And that's been a valuable thing for me with the QMAMC, kind of like we did with your hip flexor, standing up at the total gym. Like, that's always interesting to me is even if I have someone stand up and they hold their right leg in hip flexion for 60 seconds and, they voluntarily say, I have to stop, I'm fatigued. And I say, okay. And I do the QMAMC immediately after that. And it still has, good rate of force production, like it was before. But then I do the left side and they voluntarily terminate at 60 seconds as well. But when I QMAMC that, there's just nothing left. It cannot generate any force at the rate that we did before. And then I check it every 8-10 seconds and to see how long does it take before rate of force to peak for the QMAMC and torque scenario I'm in recovers. And then it's like, okay, that took 30 seconds or so, right? Understanding that each QMAMC is a stimulus and might induce a little bit of fatigue, so you have to be careful.
Or PAP,
right? So, okay, these are, again, qualitative field screens to figure this out. But that's the kind of thing that gives me some insight into going, when this hip is fatigued, it doesn't recover as well and it loses force output for a very similar set of conditions as the other side. And so I start working with that, and it remarkably, it helps like dramatically off.
It helped me dramatically, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, just
get to do that much.
It's a crazy thing, right? And so what are we messing with again? We're messing with this encoding idea, right?
Right. Yeah, because it's not always just about the position, right? I mean, it may be an endurance issue. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be going into that.
Metabolic tuning, right? Wow. So it's very beneficial to think through some of these things and understand them, and then course, from a big picture perspective, we collect data, we choose a configuration, and we're thinking mechanically about what plane and what joint axes and what perturbation direction, who's going to be opposing what, and from a general, kind of free body diagram in your head perspective. And we do a voluntary active myo to from start configuration to some final configuration. And then we see what happens. And, we do, QMAMC, and we see if we think the quality is high or low or whatever. And if not, we do some active voluntary myos, and we rest, and we check to see if quality goes up just from contracting myometrically. And, if it goes up, then maybe we'll do something different. If it's not improved, then maybe we can do something different, or we can try some ISOs somewhere in the pathway of the configurational change along a degree of freedom, and rest and recheck quality and see what happens. And if that, is or is not moving, we have some decisions we can make. We can do some active plyos, submaximal, rest a little longer, because now we've been messing with the system for a little bit, right? And then redo it, right? And then if not, we can look at different length tension, different points within the range, and the same plane, same joint axis. We can look at increasing reps or durations. We can look at anchoring system, intermediate joint parts of the system. We can choose different joint axes that are part of the reaction, maybe biasing link tension to a new configuration that's complementary to the plane or muscle groups. Check the other side, right? We often forget to do that. What's the other side doing? The side that's not actively opposing or resisting the external force.
Can it contract?
Yeah. Is it able to contribute to the stability and control of the system? And if not, you can think about an involuntary active plyo to generate a different kind of neurological response. And quality's improving. You can do new configurations, same muscle group, same plane, same joint. You can build exercises to train the configuration and develop set rest interval schemes. You can use multiple points of force application connected to another configuration, hip flexion with trunk flexion or something like that, or knee extension with hip flexion.
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing is when you're going to add another configuration, same muscle group, same plane, same joints, man, it depends on where they're at in that continuum of tolerance, because a lot of times one is enough.
Yeah, it's tough. It depends on that history and that allostatic load and what that tissue's been under and how long it's been under that situation, detrained, compensated, whatever it might be. Yeah, I agree. So that's why we need these field tools to try to figure this out. Co-contraction, you can do it with an isometric co-contraction. Look at CPG stuff and do some plyos and voluntary actives. You can go faster, rapid change directions, messing around with the nervous system, and if not, then you got all of these screening tools to see whether or not influence is coming from somewhere else. And again, going back to the top, that helps us. This helps us kind of go, you had some head injuries, or, oh, you've had 2 surgeries on this hip, or, right, the shoulder's got torn rotator cuffs, and you might have to start thinking outside the box now and getting away from whatever you're doing and go from there. So, when we look at our toolbox, we got a ridiculous amount of things that we can dig into to try to come up with different ways to stimulate the system. So, and this could be maybe another video we do. So
absolutely. I think we need to just kind of go through these one by one and talk about their role and what to use when and how to progress it. Because I mean, I think it's real important for people to understand that even if you're using a hands-on tool like the AMC, you still need to think about it in terms of proper progression.
Yes. I agree. All right. Well, we can stop here and then pick up on this and maybe spend
Let's
some
do
time
it.
doing that. All right.
Good.
Let's see. Let me see where end.